A dangerous wish. I've heard a lot of tall tales in my time, and never would have believed this one if Mr. Brad Downey himself hadn't described the strange events. Now Mr. Downey, in all the years I've known him, and all the fishing stories I've heard him tell, has never spoken a single word that wasn't the God's-given truth. Not to mention the fact he had irrefutable physical evidence that unquestionably substantiate the episode he depicted. Mr. Downey has in his possession a 7-foot bay rod, as thick as your thumb, that is permanently bent into a half circle. This hard evidence, combined with Brad's truthful nature, is surely ample verification of the veracity of this tale. How this rod became warped into this peculiar shape is one of the most mysterious and courageous fishing stories ever told. Traditionally, Brad Downey headed south for a little vacation at the end of each guide season. On this excursion, he'd gone to Key West, Florida, the southernmost point in the continental United States. Once there, what else was a professional Bighorn River guide to do but try his luck in foreign waters? Equipped with a borrowed 16-foot pontoon boat, his 7-foot bay rod, a small outboard motor, 3 peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, a 6-pack of beer, a selection of suggested lures and bait, and a small amount of local knowledge, Brad headed out to sea. Although he had gotten a late start, Brad had that lucky feeling that only a true fisherman knows. As he maneuvered his small craft south by southwest into the Gulf of Mexico, he dreamed of catching a trophy tarpon or a record tuna. His dreams turned to wishes, and he began wishing for a massive marlin or a gargantuan grouper. He imagined the fanfare on his return, the television reporters, the photographers, the interviews, and his picture on the covers of all the sportsman magazines. What a grand wish it was. But after lonely hours of trolling, Brad Downey hadn't had even a nibble. Rather than giving up, he decided to change tactics, and headed a few miles to the east to drop a line into one of the deep trenches at the edge of the Gulf, where it meets the Atlantic Ocean. Using his heaviest gear, Brad baited a hook with a whole shiner and sank the weighted line into 1,200 feet of water. He then placed the rod in the holder at the bow and proceeded to make himself comfortable. With no land in sight, the minutes turned into hours and the sun began to set. As the first star appeared in the sky, Brad knew it was time to abandon his quest and begin the long journey back to shore. Sad and disillusioned, feeling unlucky, Brad's dreams of glory had come to naught. Then, with a sudden jerk, the rod bent, the boat lurched and line began to zip off the reel. Quick as a cat, Brad dove for the rod. There was another mammoth tug, and he heaved with all his might to set the hook. This was followed by another massive yank, one that nearly pulled the experienced guide right over the flimsy rubber rail. Off balance in the rocking boat, Brad struggled to hold the rod. Nevertheless, he was smiling, and silently mouthed, "Yahoo!" One thing Brad knew for sure, whatever he'd just hooked was enormous. The rod suddenly strained even more, and the small craft started to accelerate through the water. As little boat picked up speed, Brad Downey began to speculate. What have I caught? A 2,000-pound black marlin? A giant Atlantic cod? An unnaturally large bluefin tuna? Any of these would be a glorious trophy, all of which will mean finally being recognized as the world's greatest fisherman. Time passed. The skies grew ever darker, as Brad tried in vain to land his prize. All through the night and into the dawn he fought his quarry, but every time he tried the reel, it was locked, frozen by the strength and weight of his unknown catch. Meanwhile, his small boat was steadily pulled south. Around noon on the next day, Brad Downey spotted a large landmass far off to the east in the late autumn haze. This, he reckoned, must be Cuba, but Brad remained steadfast, knowing a fisherman's greatest strength is his patience. On the second day of the battle, Brad Downey started becoming concerned. It occurred to him that his line might be linked to something other than a mammoth marlin or a tremendous tarpon. A drum or grouper might get big enough for a fight like this. He was almost certain he hadn't had the misfortune of hooking one of the numerous varieties of large ocean-going mammals. For if it had been a 30-foot orca or a humpback or sperm whale, surely the poor creature would have had to surface for air by then. Considering some of the other possibilities filled Brad with a dreadful fear. He knew all too well there were species of fish lurking in the depths that were not as desirable as wall mounts or for backyard barbecues. A great barracuda or the ugly wolfish can get to be big, but could they be large enough to drag his boat through the water at 10 knots for 2 full days? Brad Downey remembered a newspaper story about a fellow out of Noank who had caught a 3,000-pound great white shark. The mere thought that such a beast could be on the end of his line gave poor Brad the willies. There were other sharks around those water as well: the hammerhead, the tiger, the trasher, the dusky, and the mako, any one of which could easily grow larger than his meager vessel. To have latched onto one of those ferocious menaces of the deep was a horrifying thought. Brad had also heard of manta rays that grew to be 20 feet across, with barbs on whip-like tails, and once he'd seen a movie featuring a giant moray eel. Or even worse, old sea legends told of monstrous squid that attacked 100-foot schooners and crushed them like toys. As Brad was having these terrible thoughts, his little craft was pulled still further south. His struggle continued into the third night. Stunned, shocked, and shaken, Brad Downey had never spent such a frightful 48 hours. Every attempt to land his unknown catch hadn't seen the slightest progress. Now exhausted and weather-worn, the battle had taken its toll. Late that night the seas grew rough and Brad was bounced around the skiff like a rag doll in a dryer. As the miles passed, he became more and more fearful of what was at the other end of his line. His imagination began playing tricks, constantly bringing up images of prehistoric sea creatures with huge mouths filled with fangs and fins covered in claws. Finally, haggard, worn, and lost, Brad dozed off in the bottom of the boat. On the third day he woke to calm seas and pleasant smells. Brad Downey had the feeling that land was not too far away. He thought about the dreadful night and laughed, now assuming he'd probably hooked a Russian submarine, one that would drag him all the way around South America and into the Pacific. There surely must be a simple explanation for this strange adventure. Brad Downey still had no idea what he was fighting or where the battle had taken him. That's when he noticed the boat had begun to slow. In the distance he could see a hint of land to the east. Brad tried his rod again, and this time he could feel the thrashing and jerking of something alive and enormous on the end of his line. The something, it seemed, had just realized for the first time that it had been hooked. Then there was an enormous tug. Stumbling, Brad quickly released the drag and the line shot off the spool. He then began to reel again. Nothing. Had he lost the fish? Brad reeled as fast as he could. Minutes passed. Suddenly the line went taut again, and there was another massive tug. Whatever he'd hooked must have turned back towards his boat. Brad used all his strength and finally started making progress with the rod. The line began to move slowly towards the surface from somewhere very, very deep. Brad knew he had at least a mile of line out, and it was as tight as a guitar string. He pulled the rod up, straining red with all his might, and then lowered the rod, reeling as fast as he could. It was rhythmic, grueling work, hour after hour. The fight went on, with whatever it was getting closer and closer. With a sudden explosion, the creature broke the surface. The water erupted, shooting 40 feet into the air, and 5-foot white caps broke over the inflatable. But through the spray, Brad was unable to identify what was on the other end of the line. Once again, Brad Downey grew fearful. By his estimation, his quarry was over 80 feet long and probably weighed more than 10 tons. Brad then thought that something that large might not be a fish he wanted in a 16-foot rubber raft. As a matter of fact, it might not be something anyone would want anywhere near anything smaller than an aircraft carrier, especially when the creature seemed to be more than a little angry. In lonely awe, Brad Downey held fast to the rod, finally knowing he must be tampering with a mystery of the deep not meant for man. Then, without any further hesitation, he took out his only weapon, a Swiss Army knife, and cut the line. Falling straight over backwards, Brad Downey lay in the bottom of the boat, rod still in his hands. The water calmed, and the quiet was suddenly deafening. He remained that way for some time, drifting and pondering the events of the last few days. He finally had to laugh, after all. Oh, what a fight it had been. Years later, after hitchhiking home from Venezuela, Mr. Brad Downey told me there was a great moral to be learned from his adventure. Be very careful about what you wish for, because there are some fish you don't want to get into the boat.